30 years I've been digging graves, and I thought I'd seen everything the dead could throw at me. Boy, was I wrong. Name's Barnabas Crow, and I've been working Willowbrook Cemetery since I was barely out of high school. My daddy did it before me, and his daddy before him. We Crows have been putting folks to rest in this town for 3 generations. But what happened that foggy October morning? Well, that's something no amount of family tradition could have prepared me for. The court order came in on a Tuesday. Thessaly Blackwood was to be exhumed for autopsy. The family suspected her stepson had poisoned her for the inheritance money. Made sense, I suppose. The woman had been worth a fortune, and that boy never did seem right in the head. Still, digging up Thessaly made my stomach churn something fierce. You see, I remembered her funeral 3 years back. She'd been the town's opera singer once upon a time, before her voice went and she became a recluse. Even at 72, she'd carried herself like royalty. The whole town turned out for her service, and I'll be damned if I didn't tear up a little when they played that recording of her singing Ave Maria from her glory days. The exhumation was scheduled for dawn. I prefer doing these jobs early, before the curious folks start gathering. Nothing worse than having an audience when you're disturbing the dead. The fog was thick that morning, rolling off the lake like ghostly fingers. Perfect weather for grave digging, if you ask me. Keeps the gawkers away. I started digging at 5:30, the beam of my headlamp cutting through the mist. The earth came up easy enough. Too easy, almost like it wanted to give up its secrets. By 7, I'd reached the casket. Mahogany, expensive. The Blackwoods always did things in style. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks, whistling through the headstones. But as I brushed the dirt off the coffin lid, the sound got clearer. Someone was humming. Low and melodic, like a lullaby. I looked around, figuring maybe someone had snuck into the cemetery, but the fog was so thick I couldn't see past the nearest headstone. The humming got louder as I worked the crowbar under the casket lid. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, mind you. In 30 years, I'd never heard anything like it. The melody was beautiful and terrible at the same time, like something you'd hear in a dream you couldn't quite remember. When the lid finally gave way with a loud crack, the humming stopped dead. I shined my flashlight into the casket, expecting to see what I always saw, bones, maybe some hair if the family went for the fancy embalming. But Thessaly Blackwood looked like she'd been buried yesterday. Her silver hair was still perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless. The burgundy dress she'd been buried in looked fresh from the dry cleaner. That should have been my first clue to run. Instead, I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it. The preservation was impossible. Even with the best embalming, bodies don't look that good after 3 years in the ground. I reached out to check for some kind of preservation trick. That's when she started singing. Not humming this time. Full-throated opera, in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow felt in my bones. Her lips weren't moving, mind you. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper, like her whole body had become an instrument. The melody rose and fell, complex and haunting, and I swear I could feel it vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. I stumbled backward, nearly falling into the pile of dirt I'd excavated. The singing got louder, more insistent. And then I heard something that made my blood freeze. Other voices, joining in from all around the cemetery. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly through the fog. The sound was coming from everywhere, dozens of voices creating an otherworldly harmony. The recently buried, the long dead, all of them adding their voices to Thessaly's impossible song. And then she sat up, eyes still closed, that perfect face turned toward the sky. Thessaly rose from her casket like she was floating. The singing never stopped, never even wavered. Her voice wove through the chorus of the dead like a conductor guiding an orchestra. I should have run. God knows I wanted to. But something in that song held me fast, like invisible chains wrapped around my chest. The melody was pulling at something deep inside me, something I didn't know was there. I felt drawn to join in, to add my voice to theirs. That's when I noticed the cracks. All around me, the ground was splitting open. Not violent, not like an earthquake. Gentle, like flowers blooming. The other graves were opening of their own accord, and shapes were rising from them. Some looked fresh as Thessaly, others were nothing but bone and shadow. But all of them were singing. Through the fog, I could see them now, a congregation of the dead, all facing toward Thessaly like she was their choir director. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just singing. It was summoning. Thessaly had learned something in life, something old and dark, and death hadn't stopped her from using it. The song crescendoed, and I felt my own lips part. The melody was right there, waiting for me to join. All I had to do was sing along, and I'd be part of something beautiful and eternal. The loneliness of 30 years working alone in graveyards would be over. I'd have a family, a purpose. But then I remembered my daddy's words, spoken to me on my first day. Son, the dead deserve respect, but they also deserve to stay dead. I bit down on my tongue hard enough to draw blood, using the pain to break whatever spell that song had cast. With everything I had left, I grabbed my shovel and brought it down on the edge of Thessaly's casket with a resounding clang. The singing stopped. Every voice in the cemetery cut off at once, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the distant call of a mourning crow. Thessaly's eyes snapped open, fixing on me with a gaze that held 3 years of grave darkness. For a moment, I thought she might speak. Instead, she smiled and slowly sank back into her casket, her eyes closing as if she'd simply decided to take a nap. The fog lifted as the sun rose higher, and I was alone again among the silent headstones. But I knew what I had to do. Some secrets are too dangerous to uncover, and some dead are too dangerous to disturb. I filled that grave back up and filed a report claiming the casket had been too damaged by groundwater to provide useful evidence. The family wasn't happy, but they accepted it. As for Thessaly Blackwood, she's still out there, under 6 feet of earth and a new concrete seal I paid for out of my own pocket. Sometimes, on foggy mornings, I swear I can still hear her humming. But I never go near her grave anymore. And I never work alone. Story 2. I never wanted to be a grave digger. Hell, I never even wanted to work in a cemetery. But life has a way of shoving you into places you never thought you'd end up, and that's how Mordecai Ashworth, that's me, went from being a groundskeeper who trimmed hedges to someone who digs up the dead. It started with old Pete Saunders having a heart attack right there between the Hendricks and Mueller plots. One day he was teaching me how to edge around headstones without nicking them. The next day I was the only one left who knew where all the graves were located. The cemetery board didn't want to pay for 2 employees, so they handed me Pete's shovel along with his responsibilities. Most of the time, it's just maintenance work. Filling in spots where the ground has settled, keeping the grass neat, making sure the flowers folks leave don't get overgrown. But every now and then, you get the call that makes your stomach drop. The call about Cornelius Grimm came on a Thursday evening in November. Rain was already starting to fall, and I was about to head home when my phone rang. Mrs. Henderson from the law office sounded frazzled. "Mordecai, we need an emergency exhumation," she said without preamble. "Cornelius Grimm. He's been in the ground exactly 13 days, and his will has a very specific clause." I knew the grave she was talking about. Fresh dirt, no headstone yet, just a temporary marker. Grimm had been some kind of rich hermit who lived in that big house on the hill. Died of natural causes, they said, though nobody seemed to know him well enough to say what those causes might have been. What kind of clause requires digging someone up after 2 weeks? I asked. He hid a key somewhere on his person. The will states it must be retrieved on the 13th day after burial, or his entire estate goes to charity. His nephew is insistent. Of course he was. Money makes people do crazy things. I'd seen families fight over who got grandma's china, so I wasn't surprised someone would dig up a corpse for an inheritance. "I'll need extra pay for night work," I told her. "And hazard pay. Whatever you need. But it has to be tonight. The 13th day ends at midnight." The rain had turned into a full storm by the time I got back to the cemetery. Lightning lit up the headstones like old teeth, and thunder rolled across the hills. Perfect weather for digging up the dead, if you believe in omens. Which I was starting to. I parked near Grimm's grave and started unloading my equipment. The temporary marker was already askew from the wind, and I had to use my flashlight to read the name. Cornelius Grimm, died October 15th. No loving family messages, no beloved husband or devoted father. Just a name and dates, like he was already trying to be forgotten. The digging was harder than usual. The rain had turned the dirt to mud, and every shovelful seemed to weigh twice as much as it should. But there was something else, something that made me pause every few minutes to listen. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on my ears. But the more I dug, the more I was sure I could hear something under the sound of rain and thunder. A rhythm like a slow drum beat. Steady and deep. By the time I reached the coffin, I was soaked through and shivering. The pine box looked cheap compared to the fancy caskets most rich folks choose. But I figured maybe Grimm was one of those eccentric types who didn't believe in fancy funerals. That's when I noticed the coffin was moving. Not a lot, just a slight rise and fall like it was breathing. I crouched down and put my hand on the wet wood, and I swear I could feel it. A gentle rhythm, up and down, up and down. The same rhythm I'd been hearing while I dug. I sat back on my heels, rain streaming down my face, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Coffins don't breathe. Dead people don't breathe. But the evidence was right there in front of me. I pressed my ear to the wood, and that's when I heard it clearly. A heartbeat. Slow and steady, like someone in a deep sleep. And underneath that, a sound that made my skin crawl, fingernails scraping against wood. Jesus Christ, I whispered, scrambling backward. But I'd taken the job, and I needed the money. Mrs. Henderson had said they'd pay me extra, and I had rent due next week. So I forced myself to grab my crowbar and wedge it under the coffin lid. The scraping got louder as I worked. Long, deliberate scratches, like someone was carving something into the inside of the lid. The heartbeat never changed, just kept that same steady rhythm. Whatever was in there wasn't panicking. It was waiting. The lid came off with a wet crack, and I shined my flashlight inside. Cornelius Grimm looked exactly like you'd expect a 2-week-old corpse to look, except for 2 things. His chest was rising and falling with each breath, and his skin was covered in symbols. Not tattoos. These looked fresh, carved into his flesh like he'd done it himself. They glowed faintly in the flashlight beam, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. And his eyes were open. "You're late," he said, his voice dry as autumn leaves. "I've been waiting." I dropped the flashlight. It hit the edge of the grave and rolled, casting wild shadows across his face. But he didn't look angry or surprised. He looked satisfied. "You're supposed to be dead," I managed to say. "I am dead," Grimm replied, sitting up slowly. Dirt fell from his burial suit, but he moved like death was just another state of being. "I've been dead for 13 days, 4 hours, and 27 minutes. Do you know what death feels like, Mordecai?" He knew my name. Somehow, this dead man knew my name. "It's cold," he continued, "and dark and lonely. But it's also educational. I've learned things in these 13 days that living men spend lifetimes trying to understand." The symbols on his skin grew brighter as he spoke. I could see them clearly now, spirals and angles that hurt to look at directly, patterns that seemed to move when I wasn't looking straight at them. "I made a deal," Grimm said, climbing out of his coffin with impossible grace. "I would experience death completely, feel every moment of decay, every second of dissolution. In exchange, I would return with knowledge of what lies beyond." "That's impossible," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Nothing about this was possible, but it was happening anyway. "The human soul is more resilient than most people think," Grimm explained, standing in the rain like he couldn't feel it. "It can be anchored to flesh even after death, if you know the right words, the right symbols. I've been conscious for every moment since my heart stopped beating. I felt the embalming fluid replace my blood. I felt the lid close over my face. I felt the earth cover my coffin. The rain was washing some of the dirt from his face, revealing more of those glowing symbols. They covered every inch of skin I could see, like a map of suffering. And now," he said, stepping closer, "I need to complete the ritual. The knowledge I've gained must be preserved, passed on. That's why I specified 13 days in my will. That's why I needed someone to dig me up." "I just came for the key," I said, backing away. "The key is here," he said, pressing his hand to his chest. "But the price for it is higher than my nephew imagines. I need someone living to carry what I've learned. Someone who works with the dead, who understands the boundary between life and death." That's when I realized the truth. There was no key, no inheritance clause. This was all part of his plan. He'd researched me, found out I was the cemetery's caretaker, arranged for me to be the one to dig him up. "You want me to take your place," I said. "I want you to take my knowledge," he corrected. "The choice is yours, Mordecai. Learn what I've learned, see what I've seen, and carry it forward. Or," he gestured toward the open grave, "or join me in the dark, and let the knowledge die with us both." The storm was getting worse, and lightning illuminated the cemetery in stark, brief moments. In those flashes, I could see other graves, other headstones, and I wondered how many of them contained people who'd made similar deals. I looked at Cornelius Grimm, dead for 13 days but standing in the rain like he owned the night. I thought about my small apartment, my overdue bills, my meaningless job trimming grass around the graves of people I'd never known. And I thought about what he was offering. Knowledge. Understanding. The answer to the question every human being asks themselves in the dark hours before dawn. What happens when we die? What do I have to do? I asked. Grimm smiled, and his teeth glowed with the same light as the symbols on his skin. Just listen, he said, and began to whisper secrets that the dead had told him. The rain kept falling, and I kept listening, and by the time the sun came up, I understood things I'd never wanted to know. I filled the grave back in, just like I was supposed to. Filed the paperwork, told Mrs. Henderson that there was no key, that the body had been too decomposed to search properly. The nephew was furious, but the will was clear. No key, no inheritance. But I kept what Grimm had given me. The knowledge burns sometimes, especially at night when I'm alone in the cemetery. I know things now about death and what comes after, things that make sleep difficult and solitude unbearable. And sometimes, when I'm digging a new grave or tending to the grounds, I hear whispers from the earth below. Other voices, other souls who've made similar bargains. They're waiting for their own 13th day, their own chance to pass along what they've learned. I'm still here, still working the cemetery. But I'm not the same Mordecai Ashworth who answered that phone call on a rainy Thursday evening. I'm something else now. Something that stands between the living and the dead, carrying secrets that no living person should know. And I'm waiting for my own 13th day. Story 3. 23 years I've been doing forensic exhumations, and I thought I'd seen every kind of weird thing the dead could throw at me. Bodies that wouldn't decompose, corpses that had been tampered with, graves that had been robbed or moved. But what I found in that unmarked plot in Potter's Field, well, that changed everything I thought I knew about death. Name's Lazarus Bone. Yeah, I know, real subtle, right? My parents had a sense of humor. Or maybe they knew what I'd end up doing for a living. Either way, I've made peace with it. When you spend your days digging up murder victims for DNA evidence, having a name like Lazarus Bone actually helps. Cops remember you, lawyers know who to call, and criminals, well, they tend to avoid you at parties. The call came from Detective Martinez on a Tuesday morning in March. 7 cold cases, all women, all strangled, all dumped in different locations around the city between 2015 and 2017. The only connection was a single witness who claimed to have seen the same woman leaving the scene of 3 different murders. Problem is, Martinez explained over coffee at the precinct, the woman they described died in a car accident 2 months before the first murder. So you've got a copycat, I said. Someone who knew the original killer's methods. That's what we thought until we ran the DNA from the crime scenes. All 7 murders, same killer. And that DNA? It matches Serafina Vex. I nearly choked on my coffee. The Serafina Vex who's been dead for 9 years? That's the one. We need you to dig her up, get us tissue samples. Either our lab's contaminated, or we're dealing with something a lot weirder than a copycat. Serafina Vex. Even dead, that name sent chills down my spine. She'd been suspected in at least a dozen disappearances before that car crash took her out. Rich, beautiful, connected. The kind of woman who could make people vanish without anyone asking too many questions. The accident had been ruled genuine, closed the book on a lot of cases that would never see justice. Potter's Field isn't like regular cemeteries. No fancy headstones, no flower arrangements, just rows of simple markers and the occasional plastic cross someone's family left behind. It's where the city buries people who don't have anyone to claim them, or anyone who wants to. Serafina's grave was in Section 12, Plot 247. Just a metal marker with her name and dates, nothing else. I started digging at dawn, before the morning joggers hit the park that bordered the cemetery. The earth was hard-packed and full of rocks. Potter's Field never gets the maintenance money that the nice cemeteries do. By the time I reached the coffin, I was sweating despite the cool morning air. The casket was a basic pine box, the kind the county provides when there's no family to pay for anything better. 9 years in the ground had warped the wood and stained it dark, but it was still intact. I photographed everything for the court records, then got to work with my crowbar. The first thing I noticed when the lid came off was the smell. Not the usual decay you'd expect from a 9-year-old corpse, but something else. Something floral and sickly sweet, like perfume mixed with formaldehyde. I pulled out my handkerchief and covered my nose, then shined my flashlight into the casket. That's when my world went sideways. There wasn't one body in that coffin. There were dozens. They were stacked like cordwood, all identical, all in different states of decomposition. Some looked fresh enough to have been buried yesterday. Others were nothing but bones held together by scraps of tissue. But every single one was Serafina Vex. Same face, same long black hair, same expensive clothes she'd been buried in. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the impossible sight. My rational mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe someone had been dumping bodies in her grave, using it as a hiding spot. But every face I could see was hers, down to the tiny scar above her left eyebrow that had been mentioned in her police file. That's when they started talking. "Finally," said one of the fresher corpses, opening eyes that should have been clouded with death. "We've been waiting so long." "Too long," agreed another, this one mostly skeleton but somehow still able to speak. "The plan is behind schedule." "Shut up," hissed a third, somewhere in the middle of the decay spectrum. "He doesn't understand yet." I dropped my flashlight. It clattered against the edge of the grave, but the beam kept shining, illuminating dozens of Serafina's faces all turning to look at me. "You're Lazarus Bone," said the freshest corpse, sitting up gracefully despite being dead. "I've been looking forward to meeting you." "This isn't possible," I whispered. "Define possible," she replied with a smile that was all too familiar from old newspaper photos. "Is it possible for one woman to kill 7 people after she's been dead for 2 years? Is it possible for the same DNA to show up at crime scenes spread across a decade?" The other corpses were sitting up now, a chorus of decay in different stages. Some still had flesh, others were mostly bone, but they all moved with the same fluid grace, the same predatory elegance that had made Serafina Vex so dangerous when she was alive. "I never died in that car crash," the freshest one continued. "That was just the first body, the original. I learned a long time ago how to split my consciousness, to spread myself across multiple forms. Every time I killed someone, I took a piece of their life force and used it to create another me." "That's impossible," I said again, but the words felt hollow. "You keep saying that," laughed one of the skeletal versions. "But you're looking right at the proof." "The beautiful thing about having multiple bodies," said another, "is that you can stage your own death and keep working." The police stopped looking for me after the crash, which made everything so much easier. I tried to climb out of the grave, but my hands were shaking too badly to get a grip on the muddy edges. Below me, the Serafinas were organizing themselves, the fresher ones helping the more decomposed versions stand. "The problem with splitting your consciousness," said the original, stepping out of the coffin, "is that eventually you need to consolidate. All these fragments of me, scattered across time and death, they're starting to interfere with each other. We remember different things," added a middle decay version. "Different kills, different victims. The memories are getting tangled. So we need to merge back together," said a third. "Become whole again. Stronger than before." I watched in horror as the corpses began to move toward each other, reaching out with hands in various states of preservation. Where they touched, their flesh began to flow together like wet clay, bones reconnecting, tissues merging. "But we need a catalyst," said the original, looking up at me with eyes that gleamed in the flashlight beam. "Someone who works with the dead, who understands the boundary between life and death. Someone whose life force can bind all the fragments together." That's when I understood. This wasn't just an exhumation gone wrong. This was a trap. Serafina had planned this, arranged for her own body to be discovered, knowing that someone like me would be called in. She'd been waiting 9 years for the right person to complete her resurrection. The merged bodies were getting larger now, a patchwork abomination of different stages of decay flowing together into something that was still recognizably Serafina, but wrong in every possible way. Arms that were bone and flesh in equal measure. A face that shifted between fresh and skeletal depending on the angle. Clothes that seemed to be made of grave dirt and shadow. "Don't fight it, Lazarus," she said, her voice coming from multiple mouths at once. "Think of it as a promotion. You'll still be working with the dead, but now you'll be one of us." I felt something pulling at me, drawing me toward the writhing mass of corpses. My feet were sliding in the mud, carrying me closer to the thing Serafina was becoming. The sweet perfume smell was getting stronger, making me dizzy. But I'd been doing this job for 23 years, and I'd learned a few things about dealing with the dead. The first rule: they might be supernatural, but they're still bound by certain physical laws. And the second rule: fire solves a lot of problems. I pulled out my emergency flare, required equipment for anyone working alone in isolated locations, and struck it against the cap. The bright red flame cast wild shadows across the grave, and Serafina's merged form recoiled. "You can't burn us all," she said, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. "We're already dead." "Maybe not," I said, tossing the flare into the coffin where it landed among the empty clothes and remaining body parts. But let's find out. The pine box went up like it was soaked in gasoline. The flames spread quickly, and the Serafina thing shrieked as the parts of her that were still in the coffin began to burn. The merged form started to come apart, different versions of her separating and fleeing in different directions. But fire spreads fast in a dry cemetery, and Potter's Field is full of dead grass and neglected plots. Within minutes, the whole section was ablaze, and I could hear sirens in the distance. I climbed out of the grave and ran for my truck, leaving behind my equipment and any chance of collecting DNA evidence. Sometimes discretion really is the better part of valor, especially when valor involves fighting a multi-bodied serial killer who's been dead for 9 years. The official report stated that an electrical fault in my equipment started the fire. Serafina Vex's remains were destroyed along with 3 other graves, and the DNA evidence was ruled inadmissible due to contamination. The 7 cold cases went back to being cold. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone in some other cemetery, I catch a whiff of that sickly sweet perfume. And I wonder if I really burned all of her, or if some piece of Serafina Vex is still out there, splitting herself across new bodies, waiting for another chance to become whole. I don't take jobs in Potter's Field anymore. Some graves are better left undisturbed. Story 4. Everyone's got secrets they'd rather keep buried. Mine just happened to involve actual graves and things that should have stayed dead. Name's Cassius Morning, and before you ask, yeah, that's my real name. My parents were either prophetic or just had a really dark sense of humor. Either way, it fits the work I do. I've been working nights at Raven's Rest Cemetery for 8 years now. Started when I was 25, fresh out of a stint in county lockup for something I'd rather not discuss. The cemetery board doesn't ask too many questions when you're willing to work the graveyard shift, pun intended, for minimum wage. All they care about is that someone's there to make sure teenagers don't vandalize the headstones and that the sprinkler system doesn't flood the older sections. It's quiet work, which suits me fine. I walk the grounds, check the gates, make sure everything's secure. Sometimes I'll sit in the maintenance shed and read, or listen to the radio if the weather's good. The dead make for peaceful company, and they don't judge you for past mistakes. But there was one grave that always bothered me. Section 7, Row 12, Plot 3. Ophelia Nightshade, died 5 years ago. The headstone was simple black granite with just her name and dates, but it was what people said about her that made me uneasy. Old-timers in town claimed she'd been a witch. Not the harmless kind that sells crystals and reads tarot cards, but the real deal. They said she could make plants grow in winter, that she knew things about people they'd never told anyone, that animals would come when she called. Of course, people say a lot of things about folks who keep to themselves and grow their own herbs. The dream started about 3 months ago. Same dream, night after night. I'd be walking my usual route through the cemetery when I'd hear singing coming from Ophelia's grave. Not words, exactly, but a melody that seemed to pull at something deep in my chest. In the dream, I'd walk over to investigate, and the ground would be soft and warm despite the season. Plants would be growing wild around her headstone. Flowers that bloomed in the dark, vines that moved without wind. I'd wake up with dirt under my fingernails, and that melody stuck in my head for hours. The call about the exhumation came on a Thursday. Mrs. Nightshade's great-niece had finally saved enough money to move her to the family mausoleum across town. The paperwork was all in order, the permits signed. Just another routine relocation, except it had to be done at night because the family was some kind of religious sect that believed the dead should only be moved under darkness. I volunteered to handle it myself. Told the supervisor I could use the overtime pay, which was true enough. But really, I just wanted to put those dreams to rest. Maybe seeing Ophelia's actual remains would make my subconscious stop conjuring up supernatural explanations for everything. I started digging around midnight. The October air was crisp, and fog was rolling in from the river. Perfect weather for grave digging, if you believe in atmosphere. The earth came up easy. Too easy, like it wanted to give up what it was hiding. By 2 a.m., I'd reached the casket. It was a simple pine box, nothing fancy. The family hadn't been wealthy, and Ophelia had lived modestly. I photographed everything for the records, then positioned my crowbar under the lid. That's when I heard it. The same melody from my dreams, soft and low, seeming to come from the earth itself. I paused, listening, but when I stopped working, the sound faded. Just the wind, I told myself. Just my imagination working overtime again. The lid came off with a dry crack, and I shined my flashlight into the coffin. It was empty. Not empty like someone had grave robbed it. Empty like no one had ever been buried there at all. The silk lining was intact, not even dusty. But in the center, where a body should have been, was a single seed. Maybe an inch long, dark as midnight, with veins that seemed to pulse in the light. I reached for it without thinking, and the moment my fingers touched its surface, everything changed. The seed began to sprout in my hand, sending out tiny roots that tickled my palm. Within seconds, it had grown into a small plant with leaves that gleamed like black silk. The melody I'd been hearing in my dreams got louder, and I realized it was coming from the plant itself. I should have dropped it, should have run. Instead, I watched in fascination as the roots extended from my hand down into the coffin, then deeper into the earth below. The plant grew faster, its stem thickening, its leaves spreading. And wherever its roots touched, other things began to grow. Flowers erupted from the walls of the grave. Vines snaked up through the dirt I'd piled beside the hole. The dead grass around Ophelia's headstone turned green and lush, sprouting blooms that I'd never seen before, night-blooming flowers that glowed with their own inner light. The melody was all around me now, not just from the plant in my hand, but from every growing thing in the cemetery. I could hear the trees whispering, the grass singing, the moss on the headstones humming in harmony. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. That's when I heard her voice. "Thank you, Cassius." I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the wind and the sound of growing things. But I could feel her presence, could sense her watching me from somewhere just beyond perception. "Ophelia?" I whispered. I never died. Her voice came from everywhere and nowhere. I simply transformed. Became something more than flesh and bone. But I needed someone to complete the change, someone who understood the boundary between life and death. The plant in my hand had grown into a small tree now, its roots spreading throughout the cemetery. I could feel them connecting with every grave, every buried body, drawing life from death and death from life. "This is impossible," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. I was standing in the middle of a miracle, holding the key to something beyond normal understanding. "Nothing is impossible in the space between life and death," Ophelia's voice replied. "I've been waiting for someone like you. Someone who walks among the dead, but belongs to the living. Someone who could serve as an anchor for what I've become." The roots were everywhere now, visible as glowing veins running through the ground. They connected every grave in the cemetery, creating a vast network with me at the center. And I could feel it all. Every body in the ground, every life that had ended, every story that had been silenced. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Partnership," she said. "I am the cemetery now, Cassius. Every plant that grows here, every flower that blooms, every blade of grass. But I need someone in the living world to tend my garden, to help me care for the dead." The tree in my hand pulsed with warmth, and I felt knowledge flowing into me. The names of everyone buried here, the stories of their lives, the circumstances of their deaths. But more than that, I could sense their spirits, still connected to this place through Ophelia's network of roots and growth. "They're not really gone," I realized. "Nothing is ever really gone," she confirmed. "Death is just another kind of growth, another way of being. And now you can help me tend to them all." I looked around at the transformed cemetery. What had been a place of endings was now a garden of continuity, where death and life existed in perfect balance. The dead weren't trapped here. They were part of something larger, something beautiful. "What happens to me?" I asked. "You become what you were always meant to be," Ophelia said. "A guardian of the threshold, a keeper of the balance. You'll still be alive, still be yourself. But you'll also be connected to all of this, able to hear the stories the dead want to tell." The tree had stopped growing, but its roots stretched throughout the entire cemetery now. I could feel every headstone, every plot, every life that had found its rest here. And I could feel their gratitude, their peace, their willingness to be part of something greater. I made my choice. "Okay," I said. "I'll do it." The tree pulsed once more, and suddenly I was connected to everything. Every plant, every flower, every blade of grass. I could feel the seasons changing through the roots, could sense the cycles of growth and decay that kept the world in balance. I filled in the empty grave and filed my report. Told the family that the coffin had been damaged by groundwater, that the remains couldn't be moved. They were disappointed but accepted it. The dream stopped after that. No need for dreams when you're living the reality. I'm still the night watchman at Raven's Rest Cemetery. Still walk the same routes, check the same gates. But now I tend to other things too. I help the flowers bloom in their proper seasons, guide the growth of the grass around the headstones, make sure the trees provide proper shade for the mourners who come to visit. And sometimes, late at night when the fog rolls in from the river, I listen to the stories the dead want to tell. Stories of love and loss, of dreams fulfilled and dreams deferred, of lives well lived and lives cut short. The living think cemeteries are places of sadness, but they're wrong. They're gardens where the past grows into the future, where every ending becomes a new beginning. And I'm the gardener, tending to them all. Story 5. After 42 years of digging graves, you'd think I'd have seen everything. But the thing about this job is that death always finds new ways to surprise you. Just when you think you understand the rules of what lies beneath the earth, something comes along that reminds you how little you really know. My name's Silas Gravehart. Another one of those cemetery family names that sounds made up but isn't. 4 generations of Graveharts have worked these hills, and each of us has stories that would curl your hair. But this one changed everything I thought I knew about the dead and what they leave behind. The call came from Blackwood and Associates, the fancy law firm downtown. Mr. Maximilian Bone had passed away at 87, and according to his very specific will, something needed to be retrieved from his grave within 7 days of burial. The family had waited until the last possible moment, hoping to avoid what they called unnecessary complications. I should have paid attention to that phrase. Maximilian Bone had been one of those rich eccentric types that every town seems to have. Lived alone in a mansion on Elm Street, collected strange artifacts from around the world, never married, rarely seen in public. When he died, the whole town was curious about what would happen to his collection. Turns out, most of it was going to museums, but there was one item that had been buried with him. A small box, the lawyer explained over the phone. Red lacquer, about the size of a jewelry case. It contained something, significant to the estate. The will specifies that it must be retrieved exactly 1 week after burial. What's in the box? I asked. There was a long pause. We're not entirely sure. But without it, the entire estate goes to charity. The family is quite motivated to recover it. That should have been my second warning sign. But the pay was good, and I'd done stranger jobs. Plus, Maximilian had been buried in Pinewood Cemetery, which was well-maintained and easy to work in. How complicated could it be? I should have known better. I started digging at sunset, as requested by the family. They said Maximilian had been particular about timing, and evening was when he'd done most of his collecting. The October air was crisp, and leaves were falling from the old oaks that surrounded the cemetery. Perfect weather for grave work, if you don't mind the company of the dead. Maximilian's grave was in the expensive section, complete with a marble headstone that must have cost more than my truck. The inscription was simple: Maximilian Bone, collector of rare things, 1937 to 2024. Below that, in smaller text, some collections transcend death. The digging went smoothly until I hit the coffin. It was one of those luxury models, solid mahogany with brass fittings that gleamed even in my flashlight beam. But as I worked to expose the lid, I started hearing things. Whispers, like voices having quiet conversations just out of earshot. At first, I figured it was just the wind in the trees, but the sound seemed to be coming from below ground. I positioned my crowbar and started working on the coffin lid. That's when the whispers got louder, and I realized they weren't random sounds. They were pleading. Dozens of voices, all begging, all desperate, all coming from inside the coffin. The lid came off with a heavy thud, and I shined my light inside. Maximilian Bone lay there in his expensive suit, looking every bit the distinguished gentleman he'd been in life. But surrounding him, arranged carefully around his body, were dozens of small boxes. Ornate things made of ivory, jade, silver, and woods I couldn't identify. Each one was about the size of a jewelry case, and each one seemed to be moving. Not much, just a subtle trembling, like something inside was trying to get out. And the whispers were definitely coming from the boxes. I reached for what looked like the red lacquer box the lawyer had described. But the moment my fingers touched it, everything went wrong. The box flew open, and something like silver smoke poured out. But it wasn't smoke, it was a person, or what was left of one. Translucent, shifting, obviously dead but somehow still present. The spirit looked at me with eyes full of panic and desperation. "Please," it whispered, "don't let him collect you too." That's when Maximilian's eyes opened. "Ah," he said, sitting up with the fluid grace of someone much younger than 87. I was wondering when someone would finally come calling. And you've let one of my prizes escape. The spirit that had emerged from the red box was trying to flee, but it seemed to be tethered to the coffin by invisible chains. No matter how far it moved, it snapped back like it was on a rubber band. You're supposed to be dead, I managed to say. Oh, I am dead, Maximilian replied, climbing out of his coffin with impossible ease. Have been for a week now. But death is just another state of being, and I've always been very good at adapting to new circumstances. He gestured to the boxes around his body. My collection, you see. 40 years of gathering the most precious things imaginable. Not artifacts or art, those are just objects. No, I collected something much more valuable. Another box opened on its own, releasing another spirit. This one looked like a middle-aged woman, and she immediately began pleading with me to run. More boxes followed, each one releasing a trapped soul that joined the growing crowd of the desperate dead. Souls, I whispered. The purest form of human essence, Maximilian said proudly. Each one carefully selected, properly acquired, perfectly preserved. Politicians, artists, criminals, saints, I was never particular about the source, only the quality. The freed spirits were all around us now, maybe 30 or 40 of them, all translucent and shimmering in the flashlight beam. But none of them could move more than a few feet from the coffin. They were all trapped, all bound to Maximilian's collection. The red box was special, he continued, picking up the container I'd accidentally opened. My first acquisition, back in 1962. A young woman who tried to expose my hobby. I've been saving her for a special occasion. This is insane, I said, backing away from the grave. This is business, Maximilian corrected. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to capture a human soul? The preparation required, the timing, the precise moment between life and death when the essence can be separated and contained? It's taken me decades to perfect the process. The spirits were all trying to talk at once, their voices creating a chorus of desperation. I could make out fragments, pleas for help, warnings to run, stories of how they'd died, how Maximilian had stolen their souls at the moment of death. But now I'm dead myself, Maximilian said, and I need to complete my collection. You see, death has given me certain advantages. I can now take souls directly, without all the complicated preparation. All I need is someone living to serve as a new container. That's when I understood. This wasn't a simple retrieval job. This was a trap. Maximilian had arranged his own death, set up the will, made sure someone would come digging. He'd planned this entire encounter as a way to capture one more soul mine. Your soul is particularly appealing, he said, moving closer. All that guilt you carry, all those years working with the dead. You're already halfway to joining my collection. He was right about the guilt. I'd made mistakes in my life, hurt people I cared about, carried regrets that kept me awake at night. Working in cemeteries had been my way of making peace with death, but it had never really helped with the living. But as I looked at all those trapped souls, all those people who'd been stolen from whatever comes after death, I realized that guilt could be useful. It meant I still cared about doing the right thing. How do I free them? I asked. Maximilian laughed. You can't. They're bound to me now, part of my collection. Even my death hasn't changed that. The only way to break the binding would be to replace you, I finished. Someone else has to take your place as the collector. His smile faltered. You're cleverer than most. Yes, that's the only way. But why would you sacrifice yourself for strangers? I looked around at the desperate spirits, at people who'd been denied their final rest for decades. Some of them were probably good people, some probably weren't. But none of them deserved to be trapped like artifacts in some madman's collection. Because it's the right thing to do, I said. But I'm not completely stupid. I'd been thinking while we talked, and I had an idea. I'll make the trade, I told Maximilian. But I want to examine the collection first. A collector always wants to show off his prizes, right? His pride got the better of him. Of course. Let me show you some of my finest acquisitions. As he bent over the coffin to retrieve one of the more ornate boxes, I grabbed my shovel and brought it down hard on the back of his skull. Being dead doesn't make you immune to blunt force trauma, apparently. Maximilian crumpled, and immediately the spirits began to grow brighter, more solid. The boxes around the coffin started to crack and shatter, releasing more souls with each break. Destroy them all, the first spirit shouted. Break every container. I went to work with the shovel, smashing every box I could find. With each one that broke, more spirits appeared, and they all grew stronger, more able to affect the physical world. Soon they were helping, using their combined will to shatter the remaining containers. When the last box broke, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then, one by one, the spirits began to fade, not disappearing, but moving on, finally free to continue their interrupted journey. "Thank you," the first spirit said before she vanished. "We've been waiting so long." Maximilian's body had crumbled to dust when the binding broke, leaving nothing but empty clothes and the lingering smell of old books and formaldehyde. I filled in the grave and reported that the retrieval had been unsuccessful. The red lacquer box had been too damaged by groundwater to recover. The family was disappointed, but the charity that inherited Maximilian's estate put it to good use. As for me, I kept working. But sometimes, on quiet nights in the cemetery, I see shapes moving between the headstones. Not trapped spirits, but free ones, finally at peace. They don't speak to me, but I can feel their gratitude. Some collections are better broken than preserved. And some collectors need to learn that death isn't just another acquisition. It's a release we all deserve. The dead have taught me a lot over the years, but the most important lesson is this: everyone deserves to rest in peace. Even grave diggers like me.